Despite mounting international pressure, Israel continues its ground and air assault across the Gaza Strip. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Israel says it will continue its war in Gaza whether or not it has international support. On Tuesday, the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly approved a non-binding resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The United States was one of 10 countries to vote against the non-binding measure. According to the Gaza Health Ministry, more than 18,000 Palestinians have been killed since the Hamas attack on October 7th that left nearly 1,200 Israelis dead. We begin with this report from Philip Crowther in Jerusalem.
Well, it was one of the deadliest days since Israel started its military campaign in Gaza, a deadly ambush in a dense urban neighborhood in northern Gaza, in precisely the part of the Gaza Strip that Defense Minister Yoav Gallant had previously said only had pockets of resistance. In this case, the Israeli military says the troops lost contact with 4 soldiers, then staged a rescue operation, but that then led to an ambush by militants with gunfire and explosives. 9 Israeli soldiers lost their lives in that incident, 10 altogether in one day alone in Gaza. That is a lot and brings the number to 115 since the start of the military operation. Remember that ground troops have been in the Gaza Strip for 6 weeks now. Now that number, of course, pales in comparison to the huge number of Palestinian deaths in the Gaza Strip since the 7th of October. The Hamas-run Ministry of Health in the Gaza Strip says that that number is now at over 18,600. The dire humanitarian situation got worse overnight with heavy rainfall, particularly in the southern Gaza Strip. That led to flooding in some of the tent camps that are now in the south, because that is precisely where the Israeli military told civilians to go to and where they, in theory at least, should be safe. Israel is not getting any closer to a ceasefire. It's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying today that nothing will stop us and we are continuing until the end, whenever or whatever that end might look like. Certainly not an end that will come due to international pressure. International pressure comes from, for example, that vote in the UN General Assembly, an emphatic vote for that resolution for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, with no votes, not surprisingly, from Israel, but also the United States. It was also more or less at exactly the same time that US President Joe Biden had his strong criticism toward the military tactics used by Israel in the Gaza Strip, talking about indiscriminate bombing. We'll have to wait and see whether that is a term that will be used in Jerusalem by the White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. He will be here for the next 2 days and he'll be meeting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his war cabinet here in Jerusalem. Philip Crowther with the Associated Press for CGTN in Jerusalem.
For more now on the Israel-Hamas conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Canada is Michael Link. He's a Professor Emeritus with the Faculty of Law at Western University in London, Ontario, and is a former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. Also with us from Oklahoma, Joshua Landis is the Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Here in Washington, D.C., Moeen O'Day is a human rights and international law attorney and PhD candidate at George Mason University School of Peace Studies and Conflict Resolution. And from Jerusalem, Amos Esael is a senior commentator for the Jerusalem Post and a fellow with the Hartman Institute. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Amos, there's one big development, diplomatic development this week, and that is the United States is now openly criticizing Israel, with President Biden warning Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel risks losing international support. Israel, for its part, says the war will continue. What is your view on this? Do you think this warning from the United States president will change anything on how Israel is conducting this war?
I think that the strategy itself will not change because it reflects truly a broad consensus here, which is that Hamas must be eradicated, no matter how long it takes and no matter what it costs, because their threat to us has just been empirically proven as existential. Having said this, everyone here cares very deeply for what America in general says and President Biden in particular. So his rebuke to us is meaningful, and I think it's going to make the IDF be more cautious in the way it is conducting this attack.
So it will have an impact. Perhaps, the Americans have said that Israel has been indiscriminate in its bombing in the Gaza Strip. Will that change?
I don't think that this is a wise choice of words on the part of President Biden. The bombing is not indiscriminate. The buildings that are being bombarded are buildings that are mapped as housing terrorists and rocket launchers, the ones that launch the very rockets that are aimed at our houses, at our apartments, deliberately, at where the population is, and the houses underneath which the terrorists who attacked our houses, torched houses with families in them and raped our women, that's where they're hiding, and this is what we're targeting. And they're deliberately wrapping all those targets with civilians, and this is the tragedy that they create and we face. But I don't think that our attacks are indiscriminate.
Joshua Landis, if we listen to this criticism from the United States president, it's very rare that the United States criticizes Israel in this way and so publicly as well. What do you think prompted President Biden to criticize Israel in such a public way?
Well, I think that this campaign is damaging the United States tremendously and its foreign policy objectives. It's made the resistance front, made up of Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, much more popular. The Sunni Arabs used to deride them as being sort of useless, and now resistance has become popular again in the Middle East. It's destroyed and is destroying relationship with our allies in the Gulf, in particular, but it's also damaging relations with the global South much more broadly, and it's underlining a certain element of hypocrisy in American foreign policy, because Israel has now killed more civilians and more children in just 2 months, and less than 2 months, than Russia has killed in the last 2 years in Ukraine. America has decried Russia for hitting hospitals, schools, but Israel's hit more. And America is standing by them in this case. So it really demonstrates, I guess it demonstrates the prerogatives of power, but it undermines America's position in the world, its effort to uphold certain norms of human rights and the rule of law.
One other point, Joshua, and that is, as our reporter told us, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, he will be heading to Israel on Thursday. He will be telling the Israelis in person of President Biden's concerns about the war. This is the second visit by a very high-level American diplomat to Israel. Last week we had the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who went to Israel as well. What do you read into this? Why 2 high-level visits in the space of a week? What do you think they're hoping to achieve?
Well, I think they're going to underline at the time, the United States can't not stay with Israel for an unlimited amount of time. We saw the same thing in Lebanon in 1982 when Israel was bombing Beirut. Reagan could hold off the world's fury for several weeks. Here it's been, it's close to 2 months now. And I think Biden is under incredible pressure, not only from the international community and the UN, but from within his own party and within the American community. And so he's going to want to bring the word. Sullivan is going to be bringing the word from Saudi Arabia, where he just was, about what the Arabs are thinking. And also there's a growing split between Washington and Jerusalem over the question of what happens at the end of this, because Netanyahu has said there's not going to be a 2-state solution. He said there's not going to be the PLO takeover of Gaza, and that Israel is going to remain. All things that President Biden has said need to happen. There needs to be a two-state solution. The PLO needs to take over, and Israel should not be staying in Gaza to occupy it. So there's a growing chasm between Israel and the United States. President Biden is trying to smooth it over, but I think the message of Jake Sullivan is this can't go on for too much longer.
Maureen O'Day, there was that UN Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire, which was vetoed by the United States. And then, of course, there was the General Assembly resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. That is non-binding. The United States voted against that as well. This is what the U.S. ambassador to the United States, Linda Thomas Greenfield, had to say. Let's listen to her.
Any ceasefire right now would be temporary at the best and dangerous at worst. Dangerous to Israelis, who would be subject to relentless attacks, and also dangerous to Palestinians, who deserve the chance to build a better future for themselves, free from Hamas.
So, Maureen, where does this leave the diplomatic efforts to end this carnage? I mean, as we just heard, 18,000 Palestinians have been killed in under 2 months. And of course, we also have to look at the number of Israelis who were killed on October 7th.
Yes, definitely. It's not only the 18,000 or more Palestinian civilians who were killed. You are talking about tens of thousands who were seriously injured. You are talking about more than half of Gaza houses and house units are totally destroyed. So we are speaking about a total humanitarian crisis there in Gaza. I believe, as many already analysts say, that the end of this war will be that all the parties will go back to the table and talk. I don't know what is the plan for Mr. Netanyahu to do, but it's clear that he's trying to make as long a battle as possible and continue bombing Gaza because he believes that by doing this, he will continue being in power, and he hoping to give the Israeli society the picture of victory that they wanted to see. So he hoped to that the Israelis will forget his failures, what he did before that, and keep him in power. Unfortunately, people are paying their lives so far. Tens of thousands are already dead, and hopefully this should end as soon as possible. The problem is that we keep seeing the U.S. and the U.S. administration supporting fully the Israeli government and the Israeli bombs on Gaza. I don't know what is the U.S. administration thinks that how this will help their interest in the region, but it's clear that it's affecting everybody, and this should end very, very soon.
Michael Link, great to have you with us. That UN General Assembly resolution that I was talking about, the one that more than 150 countries supported, it's a non-binding resolution, but it said, and I'm quoting here, that it expressed grave concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the suffering of the Palestinian civilian population, and it calls for Palestinians and Israelis to be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. There's been a lot of debate over the past few weeks on whether the laws of war, international humanitarian law, has been broken. What is your opinion on that?
I think it's fairly clear that the laws of war were broken on October 7th with the massacres by Hamas in Israel and the kidnapping of civilians. Those are defined as war crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And I think Israel's response has been extraordinarily disproportionate and reckless. Israel has among the most advanced military systems in the world. It has missile-guided bombs and tank shells, and for it to cause such extraordinary civilian deaths, injuries, suffering, and destruction of civilian property, including universities, hospitals, courtrooms, and parliament buildings. These would all rank as war crimes as well. Certainly the decision by the Israeli defense minister early on in this current conflict to end water, food, power, fuel going into Gaza is an element of starvation and the denial of the necessities of life, which itself is a war crime under the international humanitarian law. So I think there should be a lot for the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to be able to assess the Israeli the Israeli political, military leadership, as well as the leadership of Hamas and the other Palestinian armed groups. One would hope that we're going to see a flurry of arrest warrants and potentially trials in The Hague at some point for this.
So who is going to enforce that? I mean, who will enforce that kind of accountability that you're talking about?
Well, we have probably 2/3 of the countries of the world who are members of the Assembly for the Rome Statute. Many countries, including most countries in the global north, excluding the United States, have incorporated the Rome Statute into their domestic legislation. So there always is the opportunity for universal jurisdiction to be used for anybody who may be on the soil of one of those countries. We need to see, obviously, a determined effort by the prosecutor, who has made 2 trips to the region since the beginning of the war, to follow through on his words that he's taking seriously the allegations of the violations of international law by both sides.
Amos, what is your opinion on that laws have been broken, international humanitarian law has been broken, that war crimes have been committed by both sides?
As far as the laws of war are concerned, to conduct a war when the enemy deliberately puts its own civilians in harm's way, it's legitimate for the party defending itself, which currently it is Israel, to accidentally kill civilians, tragic as it is. And that's the legal side. And frankly, I don't think that the legal side is the crucial side here. The crucial side is the political side that you, Anand, have rightly highlighted before that. The question is, what happens the morning after? And on this, I totally share Josh Landis's insight that this is the crucial question. And Netanyahu personally is indeed a problem in this regard. And that is, I think, according to polls, how most Israelis currently see him, and he's aware of this. He's aware that he's in for an electoral beating, should an election be held anytime soon, and that he's in the twilight of his career, and that no matter how he tries to reframe recent week's events, what happened here October 7th will in all likelihood be the end of his political career. And so Israel, under whatever leadership that succeeds him, will have to deal with this big question of what happens the morning after in Gaza. And I think that most Israelis today agree. First of all, they don't want to remain in Gaza. There's a clear consensus on this here. There are some lunatic fringes that think otherwise, but they're really marginal and they don't count. The broad Israeli consensus is clearly not to stay there. There are those who say that Israel needs to be in a position to shape what happens in terms of security in the Gaza Strip the morning after. But that's a different type of attitude.
Okay, Michael,
in short, what most Israelis want to see is some kind of a pan-Arab assumption of responsibility for Gaza, led by Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and of course joined by the Palestinians themselves.
Michael Link, very briefly, if you can, what about the argument that Amos just made that in the instance of civilians being killed in Gaza, they were killed by accident because they were being used as human shields by Hamas?
Well, consider what I said before, and that Israel is one of the most advanced weapons-guided systems in the world. It knew when it decided to hit an apartment building, which might have had a Hamas commander in there, that there were likely tens, if not hundreds, of Palestinian civilians who had nothing to do with Hamas in that building as well. It nevertheless would wind up making these decisions to shoot to attack the building in order to take out the Hamas commander or military leader in that building. That is no no way obeying the international humanitarian principle with respect to proportionality and distinction. And that is why even Joe Biden has been saying that Israel's bombardment
Right.
of the Gaza Strip with so many Palestinian civilians killed is disproportionate to the means sought. There are many different other less damaging ways that Israel might have been able to conduct its war, looking for Hamas and its soldiers and commanders,
Okay.
rather than putting the entire civilian population under bombardment.
Moin O'Day, on the question of what happens next, let's listen to what the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to say.
Good.
Yes, there is disagreement about the day after Hamas, and I hope that we reach an agreement here as well. I would like to clarify my position. I will not allow Israel to repeat the mistake of Oslo. After the great sacrifice of our civilians and our soldiers, I will not allow the entry into Gaza of those who teach terrorism, support terrorism, and finance terrorism.
So, Moin, we've heard from the Israeli Prime Minister himself that the two-state solution is off the table. In fact, there was an interview today, earlier on in London, done by Sky News, in which the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom said absolutely no way when asked about a two-state solution. So what does that mean for the Palestinians?
Well, unfortunately, what is Mr. Netanyahu and his ambassador is telling the Palestinians that we are blocking all the ways in front of you, and you should just surrender totally, which is, I don't think this will be an option. And instead of just talking about hope and peace and let's live together after all of the killing happened in Gaza, he's just sending more and more messages, even to the PA, who agreed to go to peace process with Israel, and even until today they are trying to control the West Bank against any massive protest against Israel. What he's saying, unfortunately, that he will fight them, and he will not allow them to continue what they are doing. So it's not clear. So what he wants, like if he thinks that the Palestinians will accept, will agree to any Palestinian leader coming on the top of Israeli tank, this will never happen. The question is, again, I believe that all what he wants, Mr. Netanyahu, is to continue this war as long as possible, hoping that the Israelis will forget his failures, and he will never get accountable internally. But I don't believe this will happen anytime.
Joshua, we have heard from President Biden. He criticized Israel. But what kind of real leverage does the United States have in influencing the outcome and what happens after this war ends in Gaza? And given that there is an election coming up next year, it's less than a year away, a presidential election, how carefully does the president have to tread? I mean, he has lost support in the United States among young people, but at the same time, support overall in the United States, according to a Wall Street Journal poll, which was published yesterday, says the majority of Americans support Israel.
They do. They do. And, you know, America has a lot of leverage. It provides almost the arms. It provides the airplanes. It provides the tank shells. It provides, you know, it's got a bill to send billions of dollars to Israel. Yeah. America stops the vetoes in the UN and it defends Israel. And of course, the American press and so forth is extremely instrumental in backing up Israel's arguments. Now, you know, will Joe Biden use those leverage? I don't think so. It's very clear that he's committed to Israel. He's made it a central part of his campaigns for his entire political life, and he depends on Jewish support. And we've seen how important that is in the universities, our top universities, where there's a great deal of sensitivity towards not only Jewish, but Israeli interests. And I think President Biden has made that calculation that by sticking with Israel, it's going to be best for him in this national campaign. America and Israel are connected at the hip. And I don't think he's going to be the first president to really separate U.S. interests and to use this kind of real leverage. The last time that happened was with President Eisenhower, getting Israel to back out of the Sinai after 1956. But since then, we have not seen it.
Amos, there have also been a bit of coverage in the Israeli press as well as the international press on friendly fire incidents in Israel. One is about what actually happened on October 7th. The Israeli military says, yes, that the Israeli military was responsible for some of the civilian deaths, Israeli deaths, that is. And it said, and I'm quoting here, it wouldn't be morally sound to investigate these incidents due to the immense and complex quantity. What can you tell us about this?
Quantity of what?
Of people who were killed.
Yeah, I'm unaware of such a quantity. There were isolated incidents. They happen, by the way, all the time in all battlefields. And Israel is not immune to this very sad phenomenon, but it's really a marginal and immaterial component of the broader picture, which is that Israel was attacked in broad daylight massively by a jihadist militia, whose agenda is not exclusively about Israel, but about global conquest. This is what we face, and this is what we should be discussing. How this confrontation should be conducted, and what its consequences will be. This is what this whole confrontation is about.
And one other development in Israel, there have been demonstrations, well, there have been demonstrations for the last few weeks calling for the government to act to get Israeli hostages released. And according to a report in the newspaper Haaretz, family members of those being held fear that the release of these hostages, of the remaining hostages, is no longer high on the public agenda. They're calling for prisoner swaps.
This is a serious grievance on their part, and it's shared by a big swath of Israeli society. And there is a great deal of perplexity here because people would be prepared to pay a very high price in turn for some kind of a swap deal. But we're groping in the dark. Nobody knows how exactly, who has what kind of leverage towards Hamas's decision makers under Gaza's ground. We now have indications that they're disobeying even their own political leadership that is based in Qatar. And Israel's dilemma in this regard is, first of all, whom do you talk with? And then secondly, what exactly are your interlocutors authorized to do? And this is, of course, on top of the purely Israeli dilemma, which is how do you both negotiate with the enemy and fight the enemy simultaneously? It's a wrenching dilemma, and I'm not sure I have much of a recommendation.
Yeah.
I don't know. We grapple with this on a daily basis here, and most of us, including myself, we know people who are victimized directly by this hostage taking, and I'm not sure what my recommendation is.
Okay, we have to leave it there. We've run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.